The Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight and the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing entitled From NPOESS to JPSS, an update on the nation's restructured polar weather satellite program. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures for today's witness panel. Before we get started, since this is a joint hearing involving two subcommittees, I want to explain how we will operate procedurally so all members understand how the question and answer period will be handled. As always, we will alternate between the majority and minority members and allow all members an opportunity for questioning before recognizing a member for a second round of questions, if we have time. We will recognize those members of either committee present at the gavel in order of seniority on the full committee, and those coming in after the gavel will be recognized in order of their arrival. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The National Polar Orbiting Environmental Satellite System, NPOESS program, was originally envisioned to reduce duplication and save $1.3 billion. Initial estimates for that program came in at $6.5 billion for 6 satellites operating in 3 orbits carrying 13 instruments, with the first satellite launched around 2010. The cost of the new Joint Polar Orbiting Satellite System, or JPSS, are now more than double the cost of the original program. But that doesn't fully reflect the dire straits the program is truly in. With JPSS, NOAA is only planning to operate 3 satellites in 1 orbit, one of which is technically a research satellite. If you were to add the cost of the Department of Defense and European portions of the system, which were originally part of NPOESS, the cost would be much higher, roughly $17 billion when you add the Defense Weather Satellite System, and well over $20 billion when you add the cost of the European spent on MEDOP. Aside from cost, the schedules have been delayed and gaps in data coverage are looming. To date, the federal government has spent over $6 billion on the NPOESS and JPSS programs, and the only thing we have to show for it is a modified research satellite that hopefully will launch next month. In the past, the program was troubled by interagency bickering, overly optimistic cost estimates, lax oversight, and technical complexity. More recently, the uncertain fiscal environment has also challenged the program. NOAA's testimony states that the projected gap in services is due to, quote, the lack of adequate, timely, and stable appropriated funds, unquote. In my mind, if the program had actually delivered on its cost, schedule, and performance, we would not be in this position right now. Unfortunately, we are in this position, and there's certainly enough blame to go around. Multiple administrations and Congresses, controlled by both Republicans and Democrats, numerous contractors, and multiple agencies all have had a hand in this program. The new problems faced by this program are the result of a perfect storm of factors: a drastic reorganization, a scheduled ramp-up in development cost, the flat funding from continuing resolutions. This committee has been consistent in both its support and its oversight of NPOESS and JPSS. This is evidenced by the committee's views and estimates that call for full funding of JPSS, and the fact that this is the committee's 8th hearing on the topic. At a hearing on NPOESS 2 years ago, I asked the questions: how did we get here? And where do we go from here? At last year's hearing, I asked, where are we going? Unfortunately, I still don't have an answer to that question. Nearly 2 years after the President reorganized the program, we still do not have a baseline. As GAO will state in their testimony, quote, it is still not clear what the programs will deliver, when, and at what cost, unquote. This is despite the fact that the NASA Authorization Act of 2005 and the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2008 requires both NASA and NOAA to provide program baselines. NOAA contends that they cannot develop a credible baseline for costs and capabilities without a stable and predictable budget horizon. On the other hand, Congress remains skeptical of entrusting the taxpayers' money with a program that is proven to be a poor steward of scarce resources without having a firm cost, schedule, and performance metric to hold the program accountable to. I look forward to working with the administration as we move forward. As I've said at previous hearings, every American is impacted by this program, whether they know it or not. It is our responsibility to ensure that the farmers, the fishermen, the hunters, the warfighters, and everyday commuters continue to receive weather and climate information. But we must not forget to be good stewards of taxpayers' money as well. Now, the Chair recognizes Mr. Miller for an opening statement. Mr. Miller, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Good morning. I want to thank the two chairs of these subcommittees for calling this hearing. This certainly continues to be a subject that needs our time and attention, and I know that Ms. Edwards may be late, but she would join with me in congratulating NOAA and NASA on the good work they have done in the last year trying to get this project back on track. It is undoubtedly true, as Chairman Brown has said, that this remains a snake-bit project, but it appears that because of your efforts it is being bitten by fewer and less venomous snakes. And sometimes you just have to celebrate small victories. This is a project that needs to succeed. We need the data that these satellites will promise. The Science Committee has devoted years of oversight to this satellite program. When I was chairman of the Oversight Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee, I led much of the work on that with bipartisan support from Dr. Brown and from Mr. Sensenbrenner. The relentless pressure from this committee and from GAO helped create the environment in which the program could be restructured, in which we recognized that changes had to happen, and NOAA and NASA were put in charge of their own fates. Once in charge of their own fates, however, our friends on the Appropriations Committee did drop the ball by failing to fund this program fully. Decisions have consequences, and that one short-sighted choice means that there will be gaps in weather and climate forecasting data. I hope we can build consensus support for this program, for a reform program, so that we never again have to ask that NOAA and NASA push back delivery of the first JPSS satellite. This committee's first hearing on the subject was in 2003, my first year in Congress. It does feel like some things never change here. At that time, the launch date for the first, then called NPOESS satellite, was projected to be 2009, and here we are in 2011, as Chairman Brown has already said, and now the first JPSS satellite, the renamed satellite, is not scheduled to launch until 2017. We are 8 years beyond our first hearing, but remain 6 years away from the launch of the next generation polar satellite. This pattern of delay must change, and the decisions made by NOAA and NASA during the last year suggest that they do understand the importance of changing that. NOAA and NASA have made some smart choices as far as we can tell, and they have put us on a path that will prevent a data gap in the next few months. However, the appropriation shortfall has ensured that a gap will happen, now projected for 2016 into 2017. That gap will mean that we will see a decline in the accuracy of forecasts beyond the 2 to 4 day window that our satellites and weather sensors support. We must do any and everything we can to ensure that American taxpayers, American travelers, American business sectors that are so dependent upon weather forecasting do get the short and long-term forecasts that are critical to saving lives and protecting property and planning business activities around. This year alone, the country has witnessed in every region and on every coastline some of the most extreme, record-breaking weather events. The more warning we have, the better decisions public officials can make about public safety, and the better choices our businesses can make. The idea of not fully funding this satellite program is unacceptable. It is remarkably short-sighted. The delays, lack of baseline, and cost overruns we will hear about today are important, but the most important fact is that the budget shortfall delivered in the fiscal year 2011 budget is going to produce a weather data gap, and any future shortfalls will create an even greater gap. In failing to support the program, we are putting our lives, our property, and critical infrastructure in danger, and without accurate and timely information, we would no longer see accurate advance warnings of extreme events. This will make it extremely difficult to conduct safe and strategic evacuations of American people from coastal areas and elsewhere. I hope we will spend our time today dealing with the needs of this program as it is, agreeing where we need to go, and determining to make sure that we all work together to get there. This program, in my first term, was a program that was snake bit in a Republican president, but there was never any suggestion that this was a partisan failure. And it is not a partisan failure now. It is something we should all be trying to make work because too much of America depends upon this data. Finally, I want to encourage NOAA and NASA to take every step they can responsibly, that they can responsibly take to narrow the projected gap in data that we anticipate after March of 2016. If you need help in getting what you need, please tell us. Please ask us to help. And I now yield back to the chairman by negative 26 seconds.
Well, thank you, Mr. Miller. You know I've never kept a tight time clock on you, and thank you very much.
26 seconds is nothing.
I know. That's exactly right.
What we put up with this committee.
I understand that. I've been around here long enough, as you know, for over 4 years now, so I do know that. Now I recognize the chairman of the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment, Dr. Harris, for his opening statement. Dr. Harris, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. Good morning. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today to testify on the Joint Polar Satellite System. I do appreciate you taking your time from what have to be busy schedules to appear with us this morning. You know, the most critical issue facing our nation today is out-of-control spending by the federal government. Knowing that we cannot spend more than we have should seem like pretty simple math, but it's taken dire economic conditions for some folks to wake up and take notice. In these times, it's even more important than ever that the money we do spend is spent wisely and efficiently. You know, the JPSS program does appear to be the poster child of a runaway government program that has overpromised, is over budget, and honestly is underperformed. While the White House's decision to split apart the defense and civilian satellite programs last year may have been the correct one, the lack of understanding about the complexity of that transition and insufficient planning appears to have contributed to even further delays and what is turning into even a more costly program. Now, there is no doubt that weather satellites play a vital role in keeping the country informed and safe. However, given the number of problems this program has experienced, the time has come to talk about what is the best way for NOAA to obtain the necessary data to make these forecasts. And by the best way, I do mean the most efficient and cost-effective way. As chairman of the Energy and Environment Subcommittee, I want to understand what policies got us in this mess to begin with, and how do we avoid the same problems in the future, because, as the ranking member said, this is a project that does need to succeed. The executive order to combine the defense and civilian satellite programs was issued in 1994, but the first satellite, the research-turned-operational satellite, is set to launch just this year. It's taken the government agency 17 years to go from initial order to the actual launching of a satellite. Given this record, it appears that NOAA actually needs to start thinking now what it will do to obtain the necessary data when the JPSS satellites are no longer functional 17 years from now, assuming they last that long. Honestly, we no longer have the luxury to blindly appropriate funding for any program in the government, no matter how essential. Careful planning, realistic expectations, and innovative outside-the-box type of thinking will be required in order to ensure weather forecasting capabilities in the future. Thank you again for your time, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. If there are members who wish to submit additional open statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this point, I'd like to introduce our witness panel. Our first witness is the Honorable Katherine Sullivan, Dr. Katherine Sullivan, Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction and Deputy Administrator at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Our second witness is Mr. Christopher Scolese, Associate Administrator for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And our third and final witness is Mr. David Powner, Director of Information Technology Management Issues at the Government Accountability Office. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will each have 5 minutes, or we may shorten that due to time and votes that are predicted to occur somewhere around 11 o'clock. It is the practice of the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight to receive testimony under oath. Do any of you have objections for taking an oath? No. Let the record reflect that all witnesses willing to take an oath by their heads being shook from side to side in the traditional method of saying no. You may also be represented by counsel. Do any of you have counsel here today? They all shake their heads side to side again. So let the record reflect that none of the witnesses have counsel. If all of you would please now stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to affirm and tell the truth, the whole truth, so help you God? Be seated, please. Let the record reflect that all the witnesses participating have taken the oath. I now recognize our first witness, Dr. Sullivan. You may proceed. And as I said, we've got votes that are projected between 11 and maybe a little after, so if y'all could hold to your 5-minute times, or maybe even if you could shorten it up, please. Dr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you here today and discuss the status of the Joint Polar Satellite System. As was noted from the panel, the year 2011 has established itself in the record books as an historic year for weather-related disasters. Truly, every state and territory has experienced some kind of severe weather event that has cost lives and exacted a high economic toll. As Deputy Administrator and, frankly, as an ordinary citizen, I'm very proud of the unfailing dedication of NOAA's employees and contractors who provided the forecasts, watches, and warnings that allowed people in these areas to take timely, life-saving actions and enabled rapid response and recovery. Members of this committee, as your remarks make clear, know all too well how critical the polar operational weather satellites are to our forecasting enterprise. Over 90% of the data that goes into numerical weather models comes from satellites, and by far the largest proportion of that comes from the instruments aboard our polar orbiters. We would indeed lose the forecast reliability upon which preparedness, response, and the protection of life and property rest if we lost this unique source of critical environmental intelligence. I'd like to take just a few moments to highlight some of the key developments that we have achieved during the past year. This week, NOAA completed the Level 1 requirements document for the JPSS program, which defines the formally validated and prioritized requirements and thus defines the scope and focus of the program. In order to collect and analyze these requirements, individuals from NOAA, NASA, and the Defense Department were designated by their respective organizations to represent and communicate the needs of their users. With the recent transition of the Advanced Technology Microwave Sounder instrument to a NASA JPSS contract, NOAA and NASA have now completed the transition of all of the capabilities and assets that were designated for the JPSS program from the NPOESS program. This is a major accomplishment for both agencies, the Defense Department, and our contractor companies. With this complete, NOAA and NASA have now returned to the weather satellite management and oversight structure that has served the nation so well for many decades. Under this construct, NOAA retains the overall responsibility for the JPSS program, while NASA serves as our acquisition agent. In addition, we are finalizing the management control plan that lays out in detail how the two agencies will work together to deliver JPSS. This document is currently being circulated for final review at both of our agencies, and we expect to have it signed in the very near future. We all know that nothing gets done without talented staff, and that challenging and meaningful work are what attract the best and brightest. NOAA and NASA management remain on constant alert to ensure that we have the right mix of skills and top-notch talent working on this program in both the contractor and civil service ranks. We've been aided in this important task, in fact, by the NPP program. Put bluntly, NPP is not only bridging our data streams between our current polar orbiters and JPSS, but frankly has served as a bridge for our workforce. I believe that this has helped us avert talent losses that we might otherwise have suffered due to budget uncertainties. Looking ahead, full funding at the President's FY12 budget request level would permit us to ramp up the workforce to levels needed to meet the current launch readiness date. This would be an increase of over 500 high-quality STEM jobs. FY11 budget uncertainties prevented us from taking these actions during that year. I'm also pleased to report that Harry Oceanic started on September 12th as the director of the Joint Polar Satellite System Office. In addition to those milestones, we have stood up the program office, fully staffed it with a competent and experienced NOAA-NASA team that leverages the expertise that had been acquired in the former NPOESS Integrated Program Office. We've selected a spacecraft bus contractor. We've accelerated the fielding and testing of the ground system in preparation for the NPP launch so that we can use that data operationally. And we've completed all of the testing and preparation activities to support that on-time launch on October 25th. I believe these milestones constitute a firm foundation for the JPSS future program success. I would be remiss if I did not address the funding picture. The FY11 continuing resolution levels fell well short of the amounts requested in the President's budget, and even after reprogramming, JPSS program was unable to move forward at the rate needed to assure continuity of data. As noted from the Chair, we now face a near certain gap of data in the 2016 timeframe. In conclusion, I would like to reflect on why we're here today. Very soon after coming aboard this past May, I visited Joplin, Missouri. My trip came just days after a major tornado ripped through the town, cutting a swath more than 6 miles long and up to a mile wide. The utter devastation was mind-boggling and heart-wrenching. I was standing in the Red Cross emergency shelter, filled with hundreds of now homeless people, when a woman came out of her way towards me, took my hand in both of hers, and looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. She had spotted the NOAA logo on my polo shirt and wanted to thank me for the warnings our National Weather Service teams had provided. These had saved her life, quite literally, and also given her time to gather a dozen of her neighbors under a sheltering staircase as the building came down around them. She knew all too clearly how much worse things might have been without NOAA's forecast and warning services. NOAA appreciates the committee's continued interest in the success of the agency's satellite programs. They are very complicated and difficult systems to build and field. We believe we are now on the right track, and though funding uncertainties continue to be a serious challenge, we remain hopeful that the fiscal year 12 appropriations process will put the program on a sound footing for mission success. And I'll be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. And I now recognize our second witness, Mr. Christopher Scolese. Sir, you may proceed. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, for the opportunity to appear today to share information regarding NASA's role in and commitment to NOAA's Joint Polar Satellite System program, JPSS. As has been stated, JPSS is essential to the nation's weather forecasting system and is critical to the nation's research activities in earth science. As the nation's civil space agency, NASA is fully supporting JPSS on a reimbursable basis for NOAA. NOAA and NASA share a 40-year partnership developing the nation's polar and geosynchronous weather satellites. That partnership continues as NOAA and NASA implement the restructuring of the NPOESS program. The 2010 restructuring of NPOESS resulted in the establishment of JPSS, as has been noted. In April 2010, NASA established the Joint Agency Satellite Division within our Science Mission Directorate to assure that NASA effectively supported NOAA's requirements for JPSS. We refer to this office as JASD. This office is responsible for the cross-agency collaboration between NOAA and NASA and assures that senior NASA management, up through the administrator, is aware of the progress and issues on this critical national program so that they can be resolved quickly. The combined NOAA and NASA team is responsible for the formulation and implementation of all JPSS missions and their associated elements, including the spacecraft, instruments, launch services, ground segments, and post-launch support. Over the past year, NASA has worked closely with NOAA to put in place a high-caliber team of experienced personnel from both agencies to implement JPSS, and that team is working well. The initial focus of the JPSS team has been to complete activities required to support the upcoming launch of the NPOESS Preparatory Project Satellite, NPP, as has been mentioned earlier. Originally, this was designed as a technology demonstration for NPOESS and to provide data continuity between key elements of NASA's Earth-observing satellites, and NPOESS, which was to replace those. NPP will now also serve as an operational bridge mission for the current polar weather satellites until the launch of the first JPSS mission. In addition to supporting the NPP mission, the JPSS team has focused the last 12 months on completing the transition of the program and contract elements from the former NPOESS program to the new JPSS program. As has been mentioned, the JPSS program is now in control of and managing all the instruments and ground system contracts. In September 2010, the JPSS program awarded a fixed-price contract for the JPSS-1 spacecraft, a bus that is similar to NPP, the MPP spacecraft bus. That was done in order to reduce risk and uncertainty in both cost, schedule, and technical. NASA shares NOAA's commitment to the success of the JPSS, as evidenced by the caliber of personnel assigned to the program and the continued support from NASA's senior management. The requirements are defined, the program is in place, and with the requested funding, we are confident that we can implement the JPSS program as planned. NOAA and NASA are striving to ensure that the nation's weather and environmental requirements are met on the most efficient and predictable schedule without reducing system capabilities or further increasing risk. With the delivery of the MPP satellite to Vandenberg Air Force Base on August 30th, the first fruits of the NOAA-NASA partnership for JPSS are undergoing final preparations for launch this October 25th. With your continued support, we expect this partnership to successfully develop and deliver the JPSS-1 mission for launch in fiscal year 2017. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I appreciate the support of this committee and the Congress for NASA's programs and for JPSS, and look forward to answering any of the questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Scolese. I now recognize our final witness, Mr. David Powner. Sir, you may proceed. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Brown, Chairman Harris, Ranking Member Miller, and members of the subcommittee, we appreciate the opportunity to testify this morning on the JPSS program. Last summer, when I testified before this subcommittee, we stressed the importance of addressing key transition risks associated with the disbanding of NPOESS and establishing the new program. We also emphasized the importance of expediting decisions on the cost, launch schedules, and the functionality to be delivered with this new satellite acquisition. NOAA and NASA have made solid progress transferring contracts and establishing an experienced program management team. To date, the contracts for the spacecraft and the 5 JPSS sensors have been transferred from NPOESS that was previously managed by DoD to NASA. Additionally, just last week, a new JPSS director started bringing solid aerospace engineering and almost 3 decades of experience to the program. Although this progress is commendable, I'd like to stress that transitioning program management to NASA alone does not guarantee success. In fact, we have listed NASA's acquisition management as high risk since 1990, given its inconsistent performance in delivering large-scale projects. Given that, it is imperative that NOAA performs rigorous executive-level oversight of JPSS. The program management plan that Dr. Sullivan mentioned should lay out the details of the program's needed governance structure. Although there is good news in the transferring of contracts and establishing an experienced management team, the JPSS program still needs to make firm decisions on the program's cost, launch dates, and the functionality to be delivered. 18 months have passed since the disbanding decision, and there is still no baseline, and NOAA does not plan to establish this baseline until later this year. Clearly, budget uncertainties have contributed to this. I'd like to highlight why this baseline is so important. First, from a cost perspective, it is important that NOAA bases its cost estimate on realistic budget scenarios. The program has an internal cost estimate, but is unwilling to disclose this until an independent cost estimate is completed. NOAA told us that this estimate should be around $12 billion. If estimates come in higher than this $12 billion mark, it appears NOAA is willing to reduce functionality to keep overall costs within this ballpark. Another reason a baseline is critical is to know exactly when the JPSS sensors will be launched so that potential gaps in satellite coverage can be managed. My written statement lays out these potential gaps. The bottom line is this: we're banking on NPP, the demonstration satellite, now used for operations to provide coverage from roughly 2012 to 2017. Due to a necessary on-orbit checkout period, the anticipated gap in coverage between NPP and the first JPSS satellite is expected to be around 6 to 12 months. This gap will increase if NPP doesn't last the full 5 years, and opinions on this vary. For example, some NASA engineers are concerned that selected NPP sensors will only last 3 years. This gap will also increase if the first JPSS launch is delayed beyond late 2016. These gaps are critical, Mr. Chairman. NOAA reports that data gaps could place lives, property, and critical infrastructure in danger. My 2 key takeaways this morning are 1, baseline the program as soon as possible, and 2, have contingencies in place to manage the potential gaps in coverage. Regarding the gap, first and foremost is NPP performance and its ability to last roughly 5 years. We'll get our first indication of this soon after next month's launch. Also launching the first JPSS bird in late 2016 at a minimum is key. NOAA has been proactively managing this situation and is looking at options to remove functionality so that the first JPSS satellite is launched possibly sooner. Expediting these decisions and contingencies are critical to ensuring the continuity of weather and climate data. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. Thank you for your leadership and oversight of this acquisition.
Thank you, Mr. Powner. Appreciate the witnesses all holding their statements to 5 minutes, just like we had a great example from Mr. Miller in doing so, holding your statement to 5 minutes. So, well, we'll call it 5 minutes. So, anyway, I want to thank y'all for your testimony. I'm reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. So please limit your questions to 5 minutes for the sake of expediency, and if the witnesses will please answer it in as short of time so we can get through as many questions as possible, because we still have votes looming. The chair at this point will open the round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Section 103A1 of the NASA Authorization Act of 2005 and Section 112B1 of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2008 prevent NASA and NOAA from entering into a contract for development of a major program unless the respective administrators determine that the technical cost and schedule risk of the program are clearly identified, and the program has developed a plan to manage those risks. The laws also direct NASA and NOAA to transmit a report to this committee at least 30 days before entering into a contract for development under a major program. Has NOAA or NASA provided a baseline for JPSS as required by the NASA Authorization Act of 2005 and the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2008?
Mr. Chairman, let us be clear, if we may, on the various usages of the word baseline, because in some contexts it means different things. We have an established program estimate of the budget. We now have a firm requirements document, the Level 1 requirements document, and on the basis of those 2 parameters, we have moved forward with this program. I can't speak to when reports were submitted prior to May of this year when I came aboard as NOAA Deputy Administrator, but I would be happy to look into those matters for you.
Well, please do, because the law requires a report to be submitted to the committee 30 days before entering into contract. Mr. Scolese, could you answer that question, please?
I'll have to go off and take that for the record, sir. The plan was identified last year as we discussed, and I'd have to go off and look at what was actually submitted.
Okay. Well, Mr. Powner, in his testimony, said that no baseline has been provided, and he also discussed very eloquently why that baseline is extremely important. GAO is saying that no baseline has been provided. Can you give us some time frame of when we can expect that baseline? Dr. Sullivan?
Mr. Chairman, when we have with the L1RD, the requirements document in hand, and when we have our independent cost estimate completed, which should be later this year, those two will be reconciled. Laying that against the first quarter fiscal year 2017 current target launch date, we then can define for you a program path forward. And we will get that to you as soon as we can. We will certainly reconcile that no later, reconcile that and accommodate that in the President's fiscal year 13 budget request.
Well, appreciate it. I know that you have some problems, as Ranking Member Miller said. There are a lot of snake bites going on in this program, and we need to cure the snake bites and go forward and get to flying birds. And that's what I think all of us on both sides of the aisle are extremely interested in doing. What are the differences between NPP and JPSS-1? How much did NPP cost? How much will JPSS cost? And why is it so expensive to produce essentially a carbon copy, from my understanding, of a satellite that is already built and prepared to launch in just a few weeks?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Both of you, or either of you.
Well, we work very closely together, so hopefully you'll see that in our answers as well. To answer the last part first, the JPSS-1 satellite is not an identical clone of NPP. As was mentioned earlier, NPP is a technology demonstration satellite. Its prime purpose was, and it still is, to go off and verify the technologies, make sure that the measurements can be made. So requirements for lifetime were not there. It was to go off and verify that we could do and meet the requirements. As Mr. Powner pointed out, there's some concern as to what
Ms.
the life.
Scolese, I've got about 30 seconds left, and I know I asked you about cost, and that's the important thing.
Well, the short answer then is, sir, is that they're not identical. There's still additional work that needs to be done on the sensors to guarantee the 7-year life. And as far as the spacecraft is concerned, we did buy that fixed price. So it's about the same price between NPP and JPSS-1, which is why you're not seeing a different price on that. But there's still development work on the sensors that has to be done.
All right, my time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Miller for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't have objected if you take another 20 seconds. Dr. Brown asked more about the first of Mr. Powner's takeaways. I want to ask more about the second, and that's the contingency planning for gaps in the data. Dr. Sullivan pointed out that we have had just about every extreme event imaginable in the last year: droughts, floods, fires, tornadoes, hurricanes. All of that would have been very helpful. It would have been very helpful to have as accurate forecasting as possible. Presumably, the satellite would not have helped with the earthquake, but otherwise, all of our extreme events, the more information we had for forecasting, the better. Mercifully, there have been no evidence of locust to this point. But we're on our 15th named hurricane. Dr. Sullivan, I know that we are pinning our hopes on the success and on the longevity of NPP, but what are the other plans for mitigating the potential gaps in coverage that we are facing over the next few years?
We continue to work hard on that, Mr. Miller, and we'll work contingencies as we go forward. I'd like to maybe just emphasize the two factors that really drive our concern to have the afternoon orbit filled. One is weather forecast models are run on 6-hour cycles, 7 a.m., 1 p.m., and then 7 p.m., 1 a.m. And as you can appreciate, a satellite that comes over just a few hours ahead of the 7 a.m. and 1 p.m. Run give you fresh data, a current snapshot of the Earth. Similarly, for the 7 p.m., 1 a.m. run, the afternoon data is very important. Second point of importance about the afternoon orbit has to do with the Earth itself, and in particular for the continental United States, to sample the atmosphere early in the morning when it tends to be a bit quiescent from the overnight hours, and then sample it again in the more energetic and active convective phase of the day. Those two very different snapshots are invaluable information, if you will. They're important information content for the models. So that is why if there is not a satellite active in the afternoon orbit, it's not just as simple as taking the morning orbit bird or taking some other satellite. The time of day actually matters. We certainly will continue to use data from the morning orbit that is covered by the European MEDOP satellite. We have and have long had a number of bilateral and multilateral data exchange arrangements with other nations. Japan has a satellite coming along, GCOM W1, that will host an instrument that bears some relevance to our needs. We're working on arrangements to take data from that satellite. Taking the data to our command center is one thing, making it possible technically in a formatting and accuracy and precision sense of that word to get that data into the numerical model is another not trivial technical challenge, but we're looking at that. So you name a nation that has a polar orbiting satellite with a relevant instrument that has the accuracy, precision, and stability needed to not degrade the forecast capability of our models, and we will make every effort to take advantage of that data.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Powner, it does appear that the gap in coverage is connected to funding problems, but also obviously the management issues. I mean, we've now been dealing with the problems in this program when we had a Republican president, a Republican Congress. We had a Republican president and a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president, and now a Democratic president and Republican Congress. It seems like this is a program. This program's problems are problems for all seasons. The criticisms of GAO, I know GAO remains critical of this program, but your criticisms do seem much less harsh than they have in the past. And there are management issues remaining. I know most of your criticism about the need for a baseline, but do you think that the new management, the joint partnership between NOAA and NASA versus the old management structure, are you pretty confident that is the management structure that can get this program on track?
Clearly, if you look historically when DoD was in the picture, it's a much more streamlined management structure. I think everyone's happier on both sides. We feel a lot more comfortable with that. I do think we would like to see specifics about how the executive oversight will occur on the program, because historically, looking at NPOESS, the executive oversight was very poor. There was a question earlier, Chairman Harris, where you asked about the problems of the past. The problems of the past were poor executive oversight, poor program management, too much technical complexity, and all those things we can't lose sight of, and we need to stay on our toes from a program management point of view. So yeah, we are more optimistic than we have been in the past, but again, it's important to continue to keep everyone on their toes. Hearings like this clearly do that, so thank you, Ranking Member Miller.
Time has expired, and I yield, well.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Now I yield 5 minutes to my friend, Chairman Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank the panel for coming here today. Dr. Sullivan, I just want to clear up one thing you said, because, you know, it's obviously a heart-wrenching story you told about Joplin. But the polar satellites really have very little to do with tornado warnings, don't they? I mean, in your testimony, I think it says they're 3 to 7 day. That's and I assume you didn't give 3 to 7 day warnings to Joplin about that tornado.
In both the Tuscaloosa outbreaks in April and the Joplin outbreaks, Dr. Harris, we did indeed warn those communities 3 days in advance of.
But that's not what that person responded to. Is not the 3-day warning. They responded to the ground-based warnings that you have. Let's just be honest. I understand the importance of telling that story, but this hearing is about polar satellites and what data we need from polar satellites. So let's get to the core of that. You know, if I don't have enough money to buy all the bells and whistles on a car because the economy's bad, I leave out the moon roof, maybe the sound system, maybe get the stripped-down model. How much of the climate change, the long-term climate change sensors on that JPSS, how much are they costing of that project? And in fact, wouldn't eliminating the long-range climate sensors so that we can focus on the core mission, what I think the core mission of the Weather Service is, which is weather, wouldn't that in fact shorten the time frame to launch of that satellite and decrease the cost?
Those sensors were in fact demanifested at an earlier milestone. I think Mr. Scolese can give you the accurate dates that predates my coming back to NOAA. So they are no longer carried on the JPSS program budget.
Nothing at all to do with long-range climate.
No, sir.
Good for you. Now, let me ask a question here. Mr. Powner, there's something disturbing in the GAO report because it says the part of this gap is because some of the selected NPC sensors, NPP sensors, may only last 3 years because of workmanship issues. Am I missing something here? This isn't in space yet. We're going to launch something up that has a workmanship issue and therefore potentially creating a gap in our knowledge?
Correct. There have been questions about workmanship issues associated with several satellites. There are examples like Chris, when you look at vibration testing, there was an issue with vibration testing, and we can go right on down the line. Many of these issues were highlighted over the years. The fundamental question is, due to some of those workmanship issues, it was originally to be a research satellite, so it wasn't built with the rigor that you would expect with an operational satellite, so keep that in mind. Some of those things are questionable, and if you listen to some of the internal NASA engineers, there's a question about whether it will last, some of those sensors, the full 5 years.
So we're going to launch what amounts to a faulty satellite, knowing that it's not going to, I mean, this is just mind-boggling to me. I mean, what are these work? I mean, did we pay the people who did this workmanship? Did we pay the engineers who designed it? I don't get it. I mean, well, maybe it's a rhetorical question. Let me ask that, Dr. Sullivan. Let me just go back to this issue of the gap, because aren't there, in fact, if this information is so valuable, and I know we share it with governments throughout the world, with other countries, so this information has value. Now, in the American system, when something has value, someone in the private sector's ears usually go up and say, wait a minute, I might be able to provide this. I scoured your testimony. I don't see anything about how we might, in fact, involve the private sector in solving some of these issues that we have in getting this data gap filled.
I'd be happy, Dr. Harris, to give you some information on requests for information that we have indeed put out to private sector companies exploring the possibility of providing data across the full spectrum of NOAA's mission needs.
Then why isn't it included in your testimony?
Omission on my part should have been.
Well, I mean, look, if this gap is so, what I need to know, and I think the committee needs to know, is, exactly all the things we're doing to fill that data gap, and that is a glaring omission, unless you believe that only the government can do the job. Now, and I suspect that's the problem here.
I do believe, Dr. Harris, when it comes to the high precision, high accuracy, and highly stable data of atmospheric sounding that is essential, that is truly the lifeblood of weather forecasting. We have seen no proposals or responders that demonstrate any sense of a market other than the United States government for instruments of that class. Okay, well, I got to tell you, medical instruments, we also need a little accuracy, and the government doesn't make any. The private sector makes high quality, dependable, when a constituent, a citizen, an American's life is in stake, true life is at stake on a daily basis, we trust the private sector to gain data for them. So I suggest that you consider that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Now, Chairman will recognize another physician, Dr. Benechek, for 5 minutes. Dr. Benechek.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just sort of amazed by the fact that these things are so expensive and we don't seem to be able to manage the construction on a reasonable basis. It seems that we went from 4 satellites to 2 and it's costing more money. How is that possible?
Well, I'm not sure that there's a very good answer for that, as NASA and NOAA really took over this program at the restructuring, and we had to go off and look at what we could do within the resources that we had available and what we could project. And that's how we ended up where we were. The original program was, as was stated, started in 1994 as principally a Department of Defense and a NOAA program that was formulated and finalized, I believe, in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So we're really talking 2 different programs here.
Well, it just seems that we're talking about $10 billion, and we went from 4 satellites to 2. I don't know, how does it all get how do we lose $5 billion? How do we go from, you know, $2.5 billion a satellite to $6 billion? I just don't see how it can be such a cost overrun then.
Well, I think we have to look at all the pieces that are in the program, and there's a ground system that's required to bring down the data or to collect the data from the satellites. It comes down to the ground. That's a piece of the total program. So you can't just divide it by the number of satellites. It's also the ground system that's there. They provide them to, and you have to help me here, I believe four locations for the civil program as well as for the DoD programs. So there's more than just the satellites that are in there. It's also the ground systems, and it's the software that will then take that data and turn it into useful products.
All right. What exactly are we getting with the new satellite that we didn't have with the old satellite? I mean, what is the upgrades? What's so new? What's new about it that's costing us so much money?
We're not really changing the set of measurements that we make, Mr. Benechek. The instruments that we have aboard or that are slated for NPP and JPSS are sounders, imagers, really the workhorse instruments that are the backbone of weather forecasting. The state of the art and the nature of current manufacturing, the complexity of those instruments increases incrementally every 10 or 20 years as the nation goes into a new manufacturing phase for the polar satellites. But it is certainly not a mission creep and an expansion of what we're doing. The complexity in terms of spatial resolution, more fine-scaled measurement to support the accuracy of forecasting that we have today, and the timeliness of data, again, to sustain the accuracy of forecasting that we have today costs more nowadays than it did in the 70s.
All right. Mr. Harris, would you like to have the rest of my time?
No, that's fine.
All right, then I'll yield back.
I'd like to recognize for 5 minutes the gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I was going through and listening to everything, and it says since the 60s we've had the two separate operational polar orbiting meteorological satellite systems. Since 2003, there have been hearings to find out and, you know, maintain some form of oversight of the JPSS program, which found itself significantly over budget, behind schedule, and considerably de-scoped. I'm listening to your discussion here today, and then it goes on. It says in '93 there was an attempt to streamline the programs. It brought them together, created the NPOESS, and then later on they say that the program was fraught with problems, delays, inefficiencies, and severe cost overruns, such that in February 2010 the Science and Technology Policy announced a fundamental reorganization of the program. So here we go. Then it goes back in and gives a little bit more detail about in 2003, again, the committee began serious oversights because of the major performance problems, schedule delays for the primary imaging instruments, which caused significant overruns, all tied to a management structure that delayed rather than fostered decisions at critical moments. Again, fast forward. At a Science Committee hearing on June 17, 2009, witnesses testified before the committee that the program leadership had deteriorated to the point that only White House intervention would assure that there would ever be any NPOESS satellites at all. So we're sitting here and I'm listening to all of this discussion, and I have a few questions. What percentage of your budget is devoted to the GOES and JPSS programs essentially being run by NASA?
I'm sorry, Ms. Adams, are you asking that question with respect to the NOAA budget or
yes,
with the NASA?
NOAA's budget. What percentage?
I can give you an estimate, and we'd be happy to provide you the precise figures.
Well, can you tell me, is it essentially a pass-through to NASA?
It is not a 100% pass-through of the appropriated funds. A sizable portion passes through for satellite acquisition, but another portion stays with us for the ground system, for flight operations, for algorithm development. The portion of the total program that brings the data to the ground turns it into useful records that can be ingested into the weather models. that portion is NOAA's direct responsibility.
Do we know if NASA is spending any of their funding on the JPSS program and how much it is?
We do know that the NOAA funding passed through to NASA for the JPSS program is being spent to that on that per se, and I can let Mr. Scolese speak to the current budget numbers.
It's a fully reimbursable program, so we're using NOAA funds.
So there's no cross-agency support funds being used?
That's correct.
Okay, I'm trying to get as many of my questions answered as possible.
One point on NPP, which was a research satellite, NASA did and is paying for the bus and for the launch.
So you're...
But that was a different program. That wasn't originally part.
But it's part of the NOAA issues, correct?
Well, it's going to be
So there
used
is some funding, NASA's funding.
for
Yes or no?
NPP. Yes, that's correct.
Dr. Sullivan, it's fair to say that some JPSS sensors are more focused on providing data essential for weather forecasting, correct?
Yes, it is.
While others are focused on long-term climate science, correct?
No, the JPSS satellite is tailored to NOAA's weather observing requirements.
So no sensors whatsoever?
No, ma'am.
Okay. That's not what we've been told, so I'm just curious.
There were climate sensors in an earlier version of the JPSS program definition. They were descoped. I would have to verify the time for you, but a year or more ago. They are in. We have a budget line within NOAA to try to launch those sensors on other platforms, but they are not part of the JPSS program.
So will they be launched on free flyers or something else then?
We're still evaluating options to try to support those on free flyers or hitchhiker payloads on commercial buses, and we expect to have some results from those evaluations by the end of the year or early into 2012.
Will you have the costs associated with that?
Yes, we should.
I'll give you back.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. Now I recognize Dr. Benechek. I mean, not Dr. Benechek, Dr. Bouchon for 5 minutes. Go ahead, Doctor.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have anything specific, so if you want me to yield back my time to you, that'd be great. I can do that.
Very good. We'll go through a second round of questions then, and because of votes now projected at 11:30, we'll limit the round of questions to 3 minutes per member. So I'll recognize myself for 3 minutes. Let's assume that the government will be funded by CRs for the remainder of the year, and most likely through all of 2012. Unfortunately, I think that's a real good bet. How will NOAA and NASA prioritize the work on JPSS if it only gets CR funding? Both of you.
Well, JPSS is certainly one of the highest priorities in NOAA's mission portfolio, so it would get a very high ranking. It's not the only important and worthy thing the agency does, but I think you could see in our actions to date during fiscal year 11 the importance that we place on it.
And Mr. Scolese, I would assume same answer.
Yes, sir. And I think I would just add that part of those funds will be used with NPP, and what we discover with NPP on orbit will also play into that, as well as the level of funds in the CR.
Well, I certainly hope, in spite of the warnings that we get from Mr. Powner about the workmanship from GAO, that satellite lasts longer than it was originally designed to do. What options does this program have for operating in the funding environment of continuing CRs? Dr. Sullivan?
I'm not sure I understand your question, Dr. Brown.
I mean, what if we have continuing resolutions, as I very firmly believe it will have, what options do you have in that funding environment for continuing and trying to get this program flying, get the birds in space so that we have this data that's necessary, and hopefully so that these gaps will be as minimized as possible?
Well, within resources available under the CR, we would certainly focus on the long lead items and try to build in the capability to accelerate or continue to move at a steady pace. We would, as we did in fiscal year 11, keep a clear eye on contract viability and try to not have to go through not only the workforce churn, but the incremental additional expense of terminating and then having to re-up contracts. I'd ask Mr. Scolese to join in here with further comments if he would like.
Yeah, as you know, one of the most difficult things for a project manager, and I've been there, is uncertainty in what your budget's going to be, because you're constantly replanning. And so that's the difficulty we'll have to do. We'll have to work with NOAA to try and establish our priorities and see if we can't stick with those. But the more replannings that we have to do, the more uncertainty there is, the more difficult it is to accomplish the goals that we all want to accomplish here.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think there are things that you really need to look at, because I think the high certainty is that we're going to have CRs for the rest of this Congress. And depending on what the election 2012 gives us, who knows where we're going to go from there. Only the Lord himself knows. But I think we are going to have CRs. I think this is going to be a huge issue for you guys. And so I think y'all need to look at every single option that's available, because I want to see these birds flying. I want to see it done in the most cost-effective way. We want to be good stewards of the hard-earned money of taxpayers that they're giving to this program. My time has expired. Now I'll recognize Mr. Miller for 3 minutes. And I took up my almost 23 seconds in that one.
I think I'm still a little ahead of you in going over. Dr. Sullivan, obviously you have received less funding for this program than what your forecast, what you expected, what you needed, what you were planning for, and you had to establish some priorities. How did you decide why the NPP satellite and the ground station updates were the top priorities for NOAA in the fiscal year 2011 budget?
I would highlight two reasons, Mr. Miller. One was the time frame in which NPP is slated to fly, and what we hope its life duration actually will be can serve as a very valuable data bridge. Secondly, it really still helps substantially in risk reduction, both improving the technology and the sensor designs that we have and that we intend for JPSS 1. And from a ground segment point of view, to be able to prepare to use the data operationally also puts us in a position to debug, to get ready for the long-term use of these instruments for the entire next generation of polar weather satellites. So it made good sense to us in a constrained funding environment to be sure we were ready to fly NPP with NASA, use the data operationally, and get our feet wet, learn the lessons that we need to learn to really be able to use that system and evaluate its long-term future potential. We, as a near second priority, also worked very hard with our NASA counterparts to keep momentum and viable contracts on the key long lead items for the JPSS portion of the program.
Okay. With my remaining time, I will just point out that a century ago, I think 4,000 people in Galveston died in a hurricane because they had absolutely no forewarning that a hurricane was moving onto shore, was out there in the Gulf. And actually, hurricanes in which thousands of people died were fairly common throughout until we developed our better forecasting abilities. And I know that this is a program we have all criticized. It has all been worthy of our criticism. But the idea of launching a satellite into space and looking down at Earth and developing data from which we could forecast weather is actually kind of hard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Dr. Benechek, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
I'll yield back the remainder of my time. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman,
Ms.
may I offer a clarification to Ms. Adams?
She's fixing to be recognized for 3 minutes, so we'll see what she wants to do with the 3 minutes time. Ms. Adams, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we've talked a lot about continuing resolutions and everything else and the costs and everything else. With what's going on with JPSS, we haven't seen a requesting from the administration, OMB, or anything, an anomaly for the JPSS program. Why?
Well, I cannot speak for the OMB and the White House on that matter, Ms. Adams. I know we are in discussions actively with the administration about ways in which we might jointly handle the program if indeed we go on to extended continuing resolutions. And I am assured from my sources that it is recognized as a very high priority by the administration, but I can't speak to their decisions on strategy and CRs.
How long does it take for POESS and GOES satellites to check out after launch?
Well, the amount of time it takes currently is reflective of the length of time that we've been running the current NOAA-K series of satellites. So it is a few months. If you'll give me a moment, I can pull the exact data up for you. We estimate for NPP that calibration validation period will take a total of about 18 to 24 months to get to the point where we have the full, precise, what we call environmental data records that are being pulled into numerical weather prediction models.
So for GOES and POESS, I have about 6 months. Is that correct?
Yes, for the current series of satellites, which we've learned multiple lessons on, we're
How long does it take in the very beginning to calibrate them?
It certainly was longer for the very...
Can you get the committee that amount, that information?
We can get you what the first run was. We estimate for...
let me ask another question here. So you believe that the reason for the length of time is because it's a newer system?
Yes.
And you didn't learn a lot from the first systems that you think it's going to take a lot longer this time?
We did learn a lot from the first systems, but the algorithms, the actual software to accomplish the similar tasks is all new software.
If I remember correctly, you told my colleague here that it was essentially the same, just a little upgrade.
The software to handle the data streams are very different. We do expect to learn a lot between NPP and JPSS-1 and have a shorter calibration validation period then.
Now, I'd like to ask how confident GAO is that NASA NOAA will be able to meet the late 2016 launch date for JPSS, given the past performances?
I think it's fair to say, if you look at the NPOESS program, we never hit a date. So we feel good about the current program management team that's in place and the executives who are overseeing this program. We're hopeful they're going to hit it, but based on past performance, it is less complicated not having DoD in the picture. Okay, that's clear. And I think what's important is let's get that baseline, manage to the baseline, and deliver in late 2016. That's what's really key, to minimize that gap.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Adams. I assume you yield back since your time's run out. Now the chairman will recognize Dr. Broun if you have any questions. Okay. Dr. Sullivan, as well as all the witnesses, I'm going to ask the members to present written questions for you, and you can, at that time, if you would, please go ahead and answer Ms. Adams' question and fill in any gaps that may be there. I thank y'all for y'all's valuable testimony today, and I thank members for all y'all's questions. The members of either subcommittee may have additional questions, as I've already mentioned, and please respond quickly with those questions, as I'm sure you will. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments from members. The witnesses are excused. I thank you all very much, and the hearing is now adjourned.
Thank you. Not too bad. A little hostile, but not too bad. I think one of the things we have to explain is that
Trying to be general. I still see you.